Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of your PA Dutch Minute. This episode is pretty special. I'm going to call it a very special episode, actually, because I got a really cool story to tell. Now, as many of you who follow me on social media know, I am really interested and have been for a long time in my genealogy. Ever since I was a young kid, even as early as like middle school, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and that meant visiting cemeteries and putting flowers on graves. And I love to walk these old cemeteries of the Pennsylvania Dutch country. And we would go to cemeteries where like my great grandparents, who I never got to meet because they all passed away before I was born, where they're buried. And then I'd hear stories, and then we would go find the next generation back, and we'd visit those cemeteries as well. So I've always had this bug of loving to research and do family history. And also, I'm a history nerd on top of it. So recently, I was doing some research, and I had heard, or I'd read somewhere years ago, that there was someone in my family that had been killed by Indians in the 1700s. A lot of families can kind of have those kind of stories, but you don't know, like, is it actually true? Did that actually happen? And I kind of tucked that story away for years. And then just recently, I came across some new information while I was doing research on another part of my family tree that linked back to this story that I'd heard. But all I'd ever heard was, or read, I think it was read, I never actually heard it from anybody in my family, that there was possibility that someone had been killed in an Indian raid. But I kind of just, brushed it off. Well, after doing more and more research and finally figuring out, I found out it to be true. And I wanted to tell that story today because it's not just unique to my family. I think all too often we think of the Pennsylvania Dutch story as a story that is purely set in southeastern Pennsylvania, but that's not the case. As we know, I've done videos on the migration of Pennsylvania Dutch down into the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, for example, down the Great Wagon Road that went down into the Cumberland Gap. And Pennsylvania Dutch, second, third generation, they went down into those parts and settled those parts of colonial America as well. So today I'd like to share with you this story that I came across from my family history, because it's not just unique to my family. It is a story that is shared by a lot of Pennsylvania Dutch ancestors. So let me tell you all about the Dutch Fork settlement. So you're thinking to yourself, oh, it's got the name Dutch in it already, so this must be pretty cool. Well, it is. So the story goes that in 1774, there were six Pennsylvania Dutch families that left the Lancaster and Berks County area, my family included. This was on my father's side, my grandfather's mother. So this would be that kind of, like, for me, that's the branch of my family tree. But there were these six families that decided to pick up and move to the frontier, actually what would become known as the Dutch Fork of the Buffalo Creek in present day Washington County, Pennsylvania. And I'll show you on a map exactly where that region is. But if you know anything about Pennsylvania, Washington County is as far west and south as you can go. It's the bottom southwest corner of Pennsylvania. In 1774, that truly was like the frontier. There were a couple white settlements west of that into modern day West Virginia and Ohio, but I mean, they were on the frontier. Why they left, I couldn't really find any information exactly why they decided to move to that part of uncharted Pennsylvania, but they did. And the families that went, here are their names: the Hoop family, the Miller, but once they get out to Western PA, it changes to Miller; the Fullenweider, which originally was Follenweider; the Rice family. Again, the English spelling would be used, but originally it was Rice, R-E-I-S. The Lefflers, which were originally the Loeffler; and the Philibom, which are that's my connection here with that family, or in the original was the Fellabaum. And as they moved out there, they were there for about 3 years before, we're looking in the 1700s, 1770s to be specific. We know that in 1776, America declares its independence from Britain, and we're in the height of the Revolutionary War. Now, a lot of the war was up in New England or here in the eastern part of Pennsylvania, but out on the frontier, the war came, in 1777 is when things started to get a little dicey, let's say. And from the records of the era, we know that all of the young men from these six families all took the oath of allegiance to the new United States of America. We hadn't won our independence yet, but we were working on it. Here's a map showing you of modern day times. The red arrow is pointing to this specific place, the Dutch Fork on the Buffalo Creek. It's right off of modern day Interstate 70, and it's only a couple miles inside of the border from the panhandle of West Virginia, really close to Wheeling. And then Ohio is right there as well. But I'm telling you, this was the frontier. And still today, it is extremely rural part of Pennsylvania. This was a land grant showing all of the families and their plots of land that they had uh, purchased and settled and cleared in the area where they were. It became modern day Donegal Township in Washington County. But this became known as the Dutch Fork Settlement because the families were all Pennsylvania Dutch and got that name. And there is this creek, the Dutch Fork Creek, flows through this region. As you can see, it's just based on on the letters of the initials of their names. So we have J.R. That was the Rice family. You'll see if you look in the right hand side, the C.P. Conrad Philibaum. That's my family's plot, or at least my relation to this. And then you can see all these other families, but they were all bordering each other. And these were pretty big tracts of land. They would have had to have cleared this land when they got there. And turned it into farmland, which was no easy task given that it was the 1700s, right? No modern day technology to help them do that. So we know from history that both the Miller family and the Rice family constructed what at the time were called blockhouses or forts, what we would consider a fort today, for communal protection in the event of an attack, either by Native Americans or by the British. There would be places for these settlers to flee to for protection. The timeline, we're going to jump ahead here now, and things start to get really exciting. In 1781, in September of 1781, 6 settlers in this very area were killed by Native Americans. Now, we have to remember that if we know our history, the Native Americans in Western PA and Eastern Ohio were supported by the British, hoping to push the Americans out. In 1782, March 8th specifically, there was a massacre of Moravian Indians, Indians that had converted to the Moravian faith at Gnadenhutten, Ohio, and that stirred things up even more than what was already being stirred up. March 30th of 1782, 70 Indians, Native Americans, attacked Miller's Fort, which was in this settlement. 2 settlers were killed in that attack. Then things calmed down for a couple months, but in the September of 1782, things heat up again. Through the 11th and the 13th of September, there was an attack by natives and British on Fort Henry, which is in modern day Wheeling, West Virginia. 240 Native Americans and 40 British attacked Fort Henry. So things excuse me, things are really getting crazy now at this point. And if you're that one of those families there in that settlement, you're hearing these stories of attacks by natives. When are we going to get attacked? I'm sure with things that went through their minds. The natives eventually did attack this settlement, the Dutch Fork settlement, in September of 1782, following the attack on Fort Henry in modern day Wheeling, West Virginia. On the 14th and the 15th, natives attacked Rice's Fort, which was the other fort, the other blockhouse in this settlement. And it was 60 natives came out of the woods and attacked this settlement. The settlers had already known that the Indians were on the move, or the natives were on the move, and many of them fled to the fort for protection in the event of an attack. My 6th great grandfather, Conrad Philibaum, was out trying to round up his cattle from what we know. And in the process, he wasn't in the fort. The natives attacked him, killed him, and scalped him. And he actually was pretty close to the fort. The people that were in the fort could see this happen. The attack then on the full fort happened around breakfast time on the 14th. The fort was defended by 8 men, but all the other families were in there as well. But there were 8 young men with rifles, well, with muskets, firing back. The attack lasted somewhere around 4 hours of constant attack. In the end, the natives killed the settlers' animals on these surrounding farms. They set fire to the Rice's family barn, which was full of grain at this point. It was September, so they'd already harvested. And, they were trying to get these people out and get them out and be able to, take them over. During the fight, Conrad's oldest son, so this would be my 9th great uncle, George Philibaum, was the only settler in the attack that was killed. He was in the fort firing from inside out at the natives. He was shot in the head through a porthole in the fort, and 4 natives at the end of the battle were killed. 1 white European settler, and that was George Philibom. While the attack was going on, the women and children of these families were all inside, also helping with the defense. I'm sure maybe they were handling, gunpowder or bullets or protecting the kids, but everybody was involved in the attack. Finally, on the early morning of the 15th, around 2 a.m., according to reports, the natives finally gave up and broke into smaller bands and then went out in different directions. And by some historians, this is considered the last battle of the American Revolution. 1782, I mean, we're already, Cornwallis down in Yorktown and George Washington, that's already taking place. And we know that this is, the end of the war is near, very, very near. I've found some the natives that attacked were made up by Seneca and Munsee Indians. That's what I found doing my research. So I included some photos of what a Seneca warrior, what a Munsee native might have looked like according to artist renditions. So you can see there. And here's a map drawn by someone that was an eyewitness to the attack. And I have the red arrow is pointing to the fort. The fort was not like what you might traditionally think of, like a 4-walled fort. It was actually 3 squares put together in that shape that you see there. And that's where the fort was. This is Rice's property because the fort was built on his property. Below or in the middle of the image is, you can see the creek, the Dutch Fork Creek flowing. You can see a box there for where one of his barns was, and his house was there to the right. You can also see I have the blue arrow pointing to where my 6th great grandfather fell. Conrad Philibom was killed there he was not too far from the fort. And then behind it, you can also see it was an open field at the time, and that's where the natives first attacked from. We're very lucky in the sense that in my 6th great grandmother's will, she left behind an eyewitness account or a comment about this attack, and I would like to read it to you. This was from her will, Sarah Philibom, my 6th great grandmother. We being greatly on the frontier line, this horrid scene happened as we were all forted at Mr. Rice's and between our cabin and his blockhouse. This happened, my husband and son, as they fell in the enemy's hand, my husband scalped, lying in his blood, which was to me a great surprise and affecting sight, the loss of a good husband and obedient son. And it is a sad story, really, when we think about it, that she was there the day and saw both her husband and her oldest son. She had 2 other children with her in the fort. The 2 other sons, they were a little bit younger, younger meaning late teens, early 20s. George, who was killed in the fort, was in his 20s as well. Now, they had other children that they had left behind back in Berks and Lancaster counties. They weren't children at the time. Conrad and Sarah were older. They were in their 50s by the time that they moved out west here to Western PA. So my 5th great grandmother, their daughter Elizabeth, was already married, and when her parents decided to move from Berks and Lancaster out to the frontier, she was already married and was living with her husband and did not decide to go. She stayed in the Berks Lancaster region, but her parents, Conrad and Sarah, did make the journey with 3 of their children out to the frontier. And now you know the rest of the story. It's really unbelievable when we think about it. So, just recently in early May, I had the opportunity to travel out. I took a overnight motorcycle trip with my good friend Sean. We love to do these overnight motorcycle trips. And I said, hey, I'd love to go find this place and see if we can actually locate this area where all of this happened. I'd read all this stuff, I'd done this research. So we decided, let's try and figure it out all. We had these old maps. We knew that there was historical markers out there because we'd seen them online. So in early May, we took a motorcycle trip out to Western Pennsylvania. Today, Rice's Fort is really close to the town of Claysville, Pennsylvania, just a couple miles outside of it. So now when we were out there, we shot some video and we found some really cool things. And I want to share that part of the story with you now. So enjoy some video from on the road, on location out in southwestern Pennsylvania, modern day Washington County, Pennsylvania, where the attack on Rice's Fort and the Dutch Fork settlement happened. So we're currently at the intersection of Dutch Fork Church Road and Lake Drive here in right outside of Claysville, Pennsylvania in Washington County. And this is where we believe, according to maps that we've been looking at, where the original fort stood and where the actual massacre took place. Right behind me is where the Rice's family farm was and the fort that was built, and it was in this general area here behind me where my 6th great grandfather Conrad Philibaum was killed in the front yard or out in front of the fort. And then as the fort was attacked, his son, his oldest son George, was also killed in the action. We believe that my great grandmother and the other 2 children were here somewhere, maybe in the fort or in the Rice's farm while the attack happens, because we do have Sarah's first-hand account of the attack. So what it looks like today, quite different than what it looked like in 1782. And behind us is the actual Dutch Fork Creek, of course taking its name from all of the Dutch families, Pennsylvania Dutch families that came and settled this area when it was the absolute frontier. So after about a 1.5 mile hike through the woods on a trail, I mean, it was an easy hike. It wasn't like we were climbing mountains or anything, but it was a 1.5 miles to get to the cemetery that is behind me right now. This is the Miller Hupp Cemetery, where we believe, we can't prove this because none of the records that we could find said exactly where the Philibaums were buried. However, when you see the one stone in here, it leads me to believe that this is probably where they were buried after the massacre. But as you can see, it's a traditional small family cemetery in the middle of the woods with a nice iron gate. Someone mows the grass. I don't know who does that, who takes care of everything, but let's go into the cemetery and check it out. So what makes me to believe that at least the Philibaums, my great-grandfather, and his son are buried here is based on what is written on this stone, particularly the line that says, and in unmarked graves, other resolute pioneers who established, defended, and preserved the western frontiers of Pennsylvania. The Philibaums were neighbors with the Millers and these other families that had come out here to this part of Pennsylvania in Washington County. There were 2 attacks, one in March of 1782, and then the big raid in September, which is where my family was, my great-grandfather was buried, or not buried, killed, excuse me. And that's why I believe, because we have no other record of where they're buried, so that's kind of why I believe they're probably here in this cemetery, since it would just be the dad and his son, because the rest of the family then went back to Lancaster County not too long after the raid happened. Welcome back from the cemetery. This is my cameraman today, Sean. He's on my motorcycle riding buddy and made this weekend trip out of. Well, it's not a weekend, but you know, I mean, overnight. So we're walking back from the cemetery. As you can see, it's not that bad of a trail. I mean, it's wide, but you did have to do some up and downs in the course of the 1.5 miles. But it wasn't bad. It was a nice hike. Saw some deer. You see anything else? No.
Chipmunks.
Chipmunks, yeah.
Chipmunks.
But it's really
Wood
peaceful.
ducks.
Like we are in the middle of nowhere, and the only reason we found this cemetery was thanks to Google Maps. I mean, it popped up, and Sean did a little research. We found a place we could park and hike in. So, yeah, thanks, Sean.
You're welcome.
So we are now just outside of Claysville, Pennsylvania, which is about 6 miles from where we filmed earlier, where the original location of the fort was. We're at a small community park. What's really cool is they moved the historical marker from the original location to here, explaining what happened. they also, we weren't expecting this, the Sons of the American Revolution created a nice little poster sign here naming my sixth great grandfather's oldest son, George, who was killed at the battle. Nice remembrance of him being, giving up his life for the cause, right? And what they also did here on this site in 2017 is they reconstructed what the fort looked like, which is here behind me. And I think they did a really cool job. I mean, based on drawings and things like that. So let's go over to the fort and check it out. So we're out in front of the fort right now, and we know from the historical record that my sixth great grandfather Conrad was killed outside of the fort. We don't know, was he trying to rush inside? Was he caught off guard by the Indians as they came out of the woods? That we don't know. But he was killed here in the front yard, essentially, of the fort, scalped, and all this happened while the other people were in the fort. So I'm sure people actually saw this happen in real time. His oldest son, George, was in the fort, and he would eventually meet his demise in there during the battle as well. So let's head inside and see what the inside of the fort looks like. As you remember the video, part of the video where we were at the original location, which now is rolling hills of farmland, this is what the original fort would have looked like. The Rices had built it on their property as a place that the settlers could come and take refuge if they needed to. And as you can see, it's kind of in 3 sections. And this would have been all handmade, of course, hand carved. This would have been in the mid 1700s. The families moved to this part of Pennsylvania in the 1770s. So by 1782, they'd have been here maybe 5 or 6 years before the actual attack happened. We believe also that there were multiple families in the fort at the time of the attack, not just the gentlemen that were defending it. It actually had 2 levels as well, as you can see. And from the records, we believe the Indians were made up of members from tribes of the Seneca Nation and also of the Munsee Nation, from what we've read anyway. So we're inside one of the parts of the fort here on the ground level. So I would imagine that my 7th great uncle, it would have been George, Conrad's oldest son, would have been positioned somewhere at a hole like this. There probably was some kind of standing platform, because I'm sure he wasn't much taller than me back then, and then aiming his rifle out. And it would have been a really lucky shot maybe from the Indians' perspective to come in there and hit him right in the head, but who knows. But you can see the ceilings are pretty low, and you can imagine the fear and the terror that the people would have been feeling in here as they're being surrounded by natives, and one of their own laying out there in the yard having been scalped. We know that he was scalped according to eyewitness accounts as well. Well, everyone, I hope you enjoyed that video. That was a longer video than normal, but I figured, this is a really cool story. Of course, it's one that's personal to me since my family was affected. Of course, I didn't know these people. However, it's a cool story to tell. And the idea of Pennsylvania Dutch people that moved outside of southeastern PA onto the frontier lines was common. And many of them came into contact with Native Americans. Sometimes these were good interactions, and sometimes in the case of my family, they were not good interactions. We'll just say that. If you enjoyed this video, I hope you would share it with your friends, anyone that you know that is really into colonial American history or early Pennsylvania history or Pennsylvania Dutch history. Please share. And if you like what we're doing here, you can financially support us by buying a coffee, and the links in the show notes down below. And please, tell your friends what we're doing here. Keep practicing your Pennsylvania Dutch. Until next time, Max gut.
Max gut.